Okay, chapter 11 of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Mezuzah. The laws of Mezuzah, we know the mitzvah of Mezuzah is a very important mitzvah, a very precious mitzvah, and certainly in Chabad, something the Rebbe made the campaign of mitzvah Mezuzah, and throughout the years when the Rebbe spoke about it, the Rebbe spoke tremendously powerful words. At one time, the Rebbe spoke something that I'll never forget is the Rebbe's words after Entebbe, when the Rebbe said about how everybody was in Entebbe. Either they didn't have mezuzahs, or they did have and they weren't properly kosher mezuzahs, or they weren't on the proper place in the door, or there was one door that should have had that didn't have. And the Rebbe spoke very much about the protection of the mezuzah. There was one case where actually Chabad came under fire because there was the terrorist attack in a city in Israel by the name of Ma'alot, where I forget the exact details, but somehow the number of victims in the attack matched exactly to the number of non-kosher mezuzahs. And there was an outcry in the Israeli media about, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that if you don't have a kosher mezuzah, you deserve to be killed by the terrorists. And the Rebbe said, Chas v'shalom, nothing of the sort. But that the protection of the mezuzah is like that of a helmet. And you don't deserve to die for riding a bike without a helmet, but if you get into an accident, then you don't have a helmet, then you won't be protected. And we will see throughout the Simon that there are many cases where, strictly speaking, there's no obligation to have a mezuzah, but yet the custom is certainly to put a mezuzah in many such doors where, again, strictly speaking, there is no obligation to do so. Okay. It is a positive commandment to fix a mezuzah on every doorway, even if you have several rooms and each room has several entrances that are made. Oh, just a second. One more introduction. There are, as you can imagine, many contemporary sefarim written on the laws of mezuzah and how to, the various customs and opinions and how to apply them to modern day scenarios. But one specific book which I want to show you, which we have here in Shul, is, if you can see this, the Mezuzah, Divine Protection and Blessing. It's a very comprehensive book of the laws and customs of Mezuzah in English, and it also specifically always mentions what the Chabad custom is. So definitely a very useful resource to have or to be aware of. Okay. It's a positive commandment to fix a mezuzah on every doorway, even if you have several rooms and each room has several entrances that are made for entry and exit. Even though you are accustomed to use only one of these doorways, nevertheless, all of the doorways must have a mezuzah. So, although so often people think out there in the world, people think, oh, my front door has a mezuzah. Now, we're certainly very pro people having mezuzahs on their front door, but one should always remember that according to that it's an obligation to have a mezuzah on all the doors within the house, the bedrooms, all the rooms, and according to most opinions, that obligation is also, the Iraisa is also biblical. Now, a key phrase over here is that he says any entrances that are made for entry and exit. So, for example, a door that's made only to exit, well, first of all, certainly an emergency exit, which might not even have a handle on the other side of the door. And also if it's like some place where you sort of have one-way traffic and you come in through one side, you come in through and you leave through the other side. And the other door is never used for entering. It's not like, the employees come in from that side and then they, it's a door. Again, we'll see later when we talk about, really stores and those type of places don't necessarily need it. In your house, the only common time you might have a door that's not made for entry and exit is an emergency exit. I don't know if there's anybody on this call. Oh yeah, Bill is here. For those who live in Winston Towers. So in the master bedroom in Winston Towers, in all the Winston Towers in the master bedroom, there is a big walk-in closet. And then from that closet, there's a door that opens up into the hallway of the building. So that door, and there's for the most part, there isn't even a handle. Most of them don't even have a handle on the hallway side of it. It's only in case of an emergency being trapped into their apartment, so it's a way to escape. So that door does not need a mezuzah because it's made, it's not made for entry and for exit. Okay, he brings here that similarly a door that's always open and it's not made to close. It's only made to close in a time of an emergency, sort of to block a fire. Then that also wouldn't be considered a door that you go through. Anyway, now even if the number of dwellers has diminished and you the present dweller now requires only one doorway, nevertheless, all the doorways must have a mezuzah. So this room was designed with two entrances because it was designed to cater to a big crowd. Now there's less people around. Nevertheless, the second doorway, which you never use anymore, still needs a mezuzah. However, if there's a particular doorway which is designated only as a place of entry for periodic deliveries, and there is also an additional doorway which is used for both entry and exit, and the doorway which is used only for delivery is exempt. The way he brings it over here in Piskei Teshuvos is that if it's something, if it's like a freight entrance, so then the person bringing in the delivery also goes through that door, so then that would need a mezuzah. But if it was a door, which sort of a doorway, which is only you sort of push in the cart, let's say, with the delivery, and then the person, the human being, goes in through the doorway. So if it's only for the actual delivery to go in and out, then it would be exempt from a mezuzah. Similarly, a mezuzah that's not used by a doorway that's not used by humans. So if you have an entry and exit, little hole, an entry and exit for a pet, right now, so those little holes don't have the dimensions of a door that needs a mezuzah. We'll see later the door has to be a certain size in order to have a mezuzah. But even if for whatever reason you had a doorway that, and you had a very big dog and you had a door designed for the dog to go in and out, and it was used exclusively for the dog and not for human beings, then that would be exempt from a mezuzah. Now he said here that if you now have less dwellers, and so now you only require one doorway, you nevertheless have to have a mezuzah on all the doors. Now that is so there's two different. There could be two questions. One is, let's say you're moving into a house, you buy a house from a non-Jewish person, and there's a doorway that you're never planning to use. There's gonna be a fixed piece of furniture in front of that door. So then you might say, okay, you're never gonna use this door, it's not obligated to have a mezuzah. Another scenario is where you have a doorway that has a mezuzah, and then you've changed the way you use things, and you're going to move a piece of furniture in front of it. But now the question isn't whether or not you should put up a mezuzah there. Now the question becomes whether you may take down the mezuzah. And there the halacha is more strict because we're very hesitant to allow you to take a mezuzah down. And many poskim say you should only do that if you've literally sort of screwed the door shut, that even if you were to, that you've really fixed it, not just to put the washing machine in front of it, but actually, bolted the door that it can no longer physically be opened. Gates opening into courtyards and alleyways and cities and provinces are required to have a mezuzah, as it says, uvisharecha. Uvisharecha in your gates includes all types of courtyards, etc. Now there are different opinions as to what type of courtyards require a mezuzah. Certainly, but certainly a backyard that that have a, sort of an enclosed area that you could use for the kids to play or whatever, for barbecues in the summer. Any sort of useful space is considered a chutzner that is obligated to have a mezuzah. If there then becomes a question, where do you put them? How do you consider the right and the left when you're going into the backyard? We'll speak about that soon. Anything else about the backyard? Okay, it talks here about cities and provinces. Now nowadays, most cities and provinces, certainly in the diaspora, don't have gates, but in Israel, it's common to have gates of cities or neighborhoods within cities, especially because some neighborhoods build actual proper gates and fences around them for the use of the Eruv. So then you would have to have mezuzah. Now, when you talk about the gate of a province or a country, the word in Hebrew is Medina, which we usually translate as a country. Perhaps it also refers to the port of entry, right? So, for example, in Ben Gurion Airport, there's a big mezuzah where you come in, even though you could say, well, nobody lives in the airport, it's just a place where people stroll around. Maybe it's not necessarily obligated with the mezuzah, but on the other hand, being the port of entry into a country may in and of itself be reason to require a mezuzah. Just suggesting. Okay. The mezuzah should be placed on the right side as you enter. If you fix the mezuzah on the left side, it's invalid. You're required to remove the mezuzah and reaffix it on the right side again and again recite the bracha. There's no distinction in this rule whether one is left-handed or not. So it's not like tefillin, that if you're right-handed, you go this way. If you're left-handed, you go that way. Always goes on the right. The reason the mezuzah goes on the right is because the pasuk says, mezuzah is beisecha, which the Gemara expounds to have the connotation of bia, to come in, and when you come into the room, the Gemara says you pick up your right foot first, which would only be true if you're right-handed. But there's also another reason the Gemara brings a pasuk or some other, I forget exactly what it is, but the Gemara explains that we learn out from that pasuk that when you come into the room, you put the mezuzah on the right side of the door. Now, we'll see soon that there are different cases where it's not clear which side. There could be two different perspectives to look at something and to determine which way is the right side. But what he's saying here is that if you have the mezuzah on the left side, that is certainly the left side. Not there's two different ways to look at it. It's absolutely the left side, so that it's completely invalid. And when you reaffix it to the right side, it has to be done with a bracha. Okay. Now, what happens if there are two houses? Now, just to make this simpler, let's substitute the word house for room, right? If there are two rooms, and each room has its own doorway, which opens either to a public domain or to a courtyard, and in the partition between the houses, there is also a door. I wonder if there's an image over here. No image, right? But pretty easy to imagine this, where you have, let's just talk on a very simple level without getting into complex cases yet. You have a front door of the house that opens into the front room. You have the back door of the house. You have a side door from the house, so you get from the street to the side door, and that opens into the back room. And there's a door in between the front room and the back room. So you could come in from the front room, you could come in from the back room. So the door that's in between room A and room B, well, where's the right? Am I coming from room A to room B or from room B to room A? So we must now deliberate how to regard this door regarding the proper side to affix the mezuzah. So firstly, we are guided by the location of the hinges. That is, the side where the hinges are attached and toward which the door opens. This is considered the main part of the house, and we place the mezuzah on the right side of the doorway, which serves as the point of entry. So first of all, he says, this is known in Hebrew as Kitzur, the guidance of the hinges, and that is the norm is for a door to open into a room. And so if you have a door that opens from room A into room B, that would mean the hinges are on the inside, right? The way the hinges work, right? The hinges are going to be, the rings of the hinges are going to be on the inside. So whichever way the door opens, that's where the hinges are going to be. So that's considered the inside. Now this rule applies only when the two houses are used equally, right? So we don't have, you come in 50% of the time from the front door, 50% of the time from the back door. There's no way to actually determine which one is from which one do you say I start out here and go into there. But if one of the houses is the main place of utility, we are not guided by the position of the hinges, but we should always place the mezuzah on the right side of the entrance to the house, which is the main place of utility. This applies even if the door opens into the second house. Now, with regards to this, there's a number of things that have to be clarified. So first of all, what does it mean, the main utility? And there's very many different opinions in the poskim exactly how we judge this, but the pretty much the most common approach is like this. The first, when you're trying to determine which side you put on which side are you going from A into B and putting the mezuzah on the right from there into there.
So the first thing is, which one is more inside, right? If you imagine you're coming in from the front door, and then you go to the back of the house, which opens into the backyard, which is enclosed, so you're never coming in from the back. So whatever is more pnimi, whatever is more inside, more toward the inside of the house, so you're always going to say you're coming from the outside to the inside. But if it's equal, like we said in this scenario, where you have two entrances into a room from either side, so the common way to paskin is that the first determining factor should be, what is your ikar hiluch? What is your main flow of traffic? Is your main flow of traffic to come into the front door, or go to the kitchen, or from the kitchen into the living room, or do you usually go from the living room into the dining room? That should be your first determining factor. And there could be many, and with this type of thing, things can change. You could change your habits. Now, obviously, you change your habit one time, that doesn't do anything, but the way you for example, something that comes up, that I've had this question before, people have to move mezuzahs, is somebody moved into a house, and they have a garage, and they're parking in the garage. So the garage becomes, even though the guests come into the house from the front door, but as far as the owner of the house is concerned, and he's the one who determines this, what we colloquially call the back door can halachically be the front door, right? Then after a few months, his garage starts becoming his his manhole, and he starts parking on the street and coming in through the front door. So now everything gets switched around because you're coming from, right? So things can change, and of course, if your habits change, then you also need to change your way of the door. I wouldn't say you make a bracha on switching it, because that's a case where it might not be so clear cut, but that is something to be aware of. If when you moved into your house and when the rabbi did the walkthrough and put the mezuzahs up a certain way, and then your habits have changed, be mindful of it. It might be time to change it. Now, if Rav Hiluch cannot determine it, sometimes it's not, I don't know, sometimes I come to the kitchen, sometimes I come to the living room, it's not clear. So then the next determining factor is Rav Shimush, which means Ikar Tashmisha. What is this? Which of these two rooms has a more primary residential usage to it, right? So a bedroom, imagine if you had your bedroom adjacent to your kitchen, right? So the door between the kitchen and the bedroom, right? And let's say you come in 50% of the time from the back door into the kitchen, into the bedroom, and 50% of the time you come in through the whatever, you have an egress in your bedroom and you come in there. But a bedroom is more of a dwelling quarter than a kitchen, right? So therefore, in that case, you would say you're going from the kitchen into the bedroom, because that's more of an ikar shimush. Similarly, usually a dining room is going to be, and this is quite common locally in the Georgian houses that we have over here, that you're going to have a doorway from the kitchen into the dining room, or is it from the dining room into the kitchen? So usually it's hard to determine by flow of traffic, because you come, the way the Georgians are laid out, that's not often the thing. But for the most part, your dining room is more, and your dining room and living room is more of a dwelling place than is your kitchen, right? It's not so clear cut, because some kitchens have an eating area, and you might eat in the kitchen all week and only eat in the dining room on Shabbos. So maybe that case is not so clear cut, but I think in many cases it's quite clear cut that the dining room is more of a shimush, dwelling quarters, than is the kitchen. In absence of any of those two factors, so then the third factor to go by is hekatzir. Which way does the door open? Now, Chabad have a very unusual custom. Chabad custom is that even if ikar hiluch and ikar shimush are very clear to be one way, so your flow of traffic is one way, and your how do you call it? Your primary usage is the same as the flow of traffic, but the door is fixed the other way, and your hinge opens the other way. We go by hekatzir. We use hekatzir not as the last determining factor, but we use the hinges as the first determining factor. Now, this custom of Chabad is not recorded like in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. We actually don't have any. The laws of Mezuzah in Shulchan Aruch and Yerideh, which is the second of the 4 sections of Shulchan Aruch, on which we don't have. We have a little bit from the Alter Rebbe, but we don't have the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch on the laws of Mezuzah. So it's not explicit in the laws of Mezuzah, but it's a tradition that goes back generations in Chabad, and it's throughout Chabad. There's no different opinion. In Chabad, it's very clear, and much ink has been spilled to try and explain and justify the Chabad custom and how does it fit with the Gemaras and the Rambams and there's much. We're not going to get into that whole discussion right now. Bottom line is Chabad custom is we always use Heketzir first, Now, nevertheless, it's still very important to know these other determining factors for a few reasons. The most obvious reason is because not always do you have a door, right? Again, just going by the local Georgians, all the doorways between the living room, dining room, kitchen usually don't have a door. So if there's no door, then of course Heketzir is not applicable. The hinges are not applicable, and it's just a doorway. And then you have to follow the other determining factors. Another, that's A. Just a moment. Even with a door, you have a swinging door, a sliding door. So usually in those cases, there's not going to be any Heketzir. Now there is amongst Chabad rabbis within Chabad itself, there are some areas of Heketzir which are not unanimously agreed on. One of them is what do you do about one tradition of the Chabad custom is that you only go by Heketzir if there is at least theoretically another way to enter the room. So I think the Rebbe Maharash is said to have said that you could come in through a window, right? So what about a room? And this is quite common. What about a room that doesn't have a window or any other, or doesn't have a window that's big enough for a human being to climb through? So do you say it doesn't matter? You always follow the hinges, and the way I personally do it, the way I learned from my teachers, and there's various stories of the Rebbe to back this up. We're not going to sort of go through all the different sides of the debate right now, but that in a room where there is no window and no even theoretical place to fly in from without crashing a hole into the brick wall, then you do not follow Heketzir, right? So if you have it's quite common in a basement, you might have a bedroom. Now, 1 second. Okay, so another area where Heketzir has become even more or challenging nowadays, especially for Chabad, is that it's become common practice, and this is basically because of codes and all these type of things, that many doors, especially in big buildings, open outward. So if you think about in your own house, usually the door to the bedroom will open into the door. But if you think about in buildings, just right here in the room that we're sitting on, so we have there's 5 doors to this room. One is a sliding door, there's no Heketzir. 2 over here are doors to the street, which do have mezuzahs, but technically they probably don't need mezuzahs because they're basically emergency exits. And in the 5 years that I've been here, I can remember once, maybe twice, where anybody ever used those doors to come in from. Right. So I don't know if these 2 doors technically need mezuzahs at all. Right now, okay, so I skipped something which is obvious, but maybe not so obvious. But either way, these 2 doors, which open straight up into the street, you for sure don't go by Heketzir. You don't follow. You only with an internal door within the house do you say you follow Heketzir. This is a door going into the street. You don't put a mezuzah on the right going into the street. The street is not a place that requires a mezuzah, right? But then we have the 2 back doors, which, again, if this wasn't a Chabad place, those mezuzahs would be on the right, coming from the hallway into the shul. That would be the way that makes sense. You come into the shul, right? But because those doors open outward, which again I assume is a code thing, it's whatever it is, it's the common practice in practice. So it's become more and more common where you have doorways which any rabbi outside of Chabad would say, well, no, it's very obvious that you're going from the hallway into the room. But nevertheless, in Chabad, we will follow the Heketzir and put it by going, in this. It does look strange. You have these mezuzahs which seem to be on the left coming into the room. Now, but if it's a room, again, like it's common in a basement, where you might have a let's say somebody adds a bedroom into the basement and it's like a makeshift and you're tight on space, so you might design it in the way that the door opens outward. So if that bedroom doesn't have any windows in it, so then according to many Chabad rabbis, and this is the way I personally do it, is that you would put you would not follow Kitzur, you would put the mezuzah on the right going into the door, into the room. Another area, and here also, by the way, if you're doing construction, things could change. So for example, I remember when I was in yeshiva, there was one of the yeshivas I went in, the dining room had the mezuzah quote on the left going into the room because there was the door open outward into the hallway. Now, in the middle of the year, they were dividing up the classes and the schedules differently, so they wanted to split the dining room into two. So it was a double door, and they made a wall down the middle, so it split the dining room into two rooms. So the doors are still opening outward, and there's two different rooms now. Now, the room on the left, that's where their emergency exit was, so that made sense. You go by Kitzur. But the one on the right, which is now a separate room with no window, now we had to turn around the mezuzah to go the other way. Now, just for fun, I'll point out to you that there is one mezuzah in this building, which used to be by Kitzur, and yours truly, based on the guidance of a Rav, of multiple Rabbanim, after some discussion, changed it. And that is when you come into the front door, so obviously the front door, even though the front door opens into the street, we still put the mezuzah on the right. And then there's a tiny little, I guess you would call it a vestibule, right? And then there's another door that comes into the hallway. Now that second door opens into the vestibule. Is that the right, am I using the right word, vestibule? Right. So it used to be, that mezuzah used to be on the right going into the vestibule. Now I changed it. The reason I changed it is because, again, I didn't decide this myself, but the reason it was changed is that room, that little vestibule isn't a room that requires a mezuzah in and of itself. In halacha, it's called a beis shar. It's called, how does it call it in English? It's
not big enough for one.
Well, there's two things. First of all, it's not big enough for one. It's not 6 feet by 6 feet, which we'll get to soon. And even if it were big enough for one, it's not a room that's used in and of itself. It's a room that's used as an entryway, as a passage into the building. Now, a passageway isn't a room where you use it for your living quarters. It's exactly that. It's a passageway. And so it's only a beis shar. The word in Hebrew is a beis shar. I forget what the English word is now, but an entranceway is only obligated as a mezuzah by virtue of the fact that it leads into the building. Yes, in this case, it happens to be further underscored by the fact that the room itself is a small room that isn't the size to require a mezuzah. And so it doesn't make sense to say that you're putting it on the right going into the vestibule. The vestibule doesn't need a mezuzah. So if you say that the only determining factor is the hinges, so then you could not have any mezuzah at all over there. So that's why it was switched around. You could see there's still a mark of where the tape was on the other side, but that's why it was switched around. Okay. I think we could move on to the next. Mezuzah must be fixed in the beginning of the upper third. Hold on. Yeah. At the beginning of the upper third of the height of the doorpost. If you fix it higher than this, it is also valid, providing it is distance at least one tefach, a handbreadth, from the mashke, from the lintel. If you affix the mezuzah below the upper third of the doorpost, you must remove the mezuzah and reaffix it in the proper manner and recite the bracha. If you place the mezuzah within the uppermost tefach, you should also remove it and reaffix it properly, but without reciting the bracha. So what he's saying is like this. What's the correct placing for the mezuzah? So you divide the entire height of the doorpost. Let's say an average doorpost, an average doorway in Chicago, and from what I've measured, is usually about 81 inches, give or take. So you divide that into 3, and you place the mezuzah at the bottom of the top third. So, it's going to be about 26. Each third is going to be approximately 26 inches, let's say. So you measure 26 inches down from the top of the doorway. And that mark at 26 inches, that's where the bottom of your mezuzah should be. Now, if you put it higher than that, some people are very careful to measure exactly and perhaps that's ideal. But if you put it higher than the bottom of the top third, that's fine, as long as it's not within the top tefach. If it's at the very top of the doorway, a tefach is a handbreadth, 8 centimeters, whatever it is, 3.5, 4 inches. If it's within the top tefach, then he says it's not valid at all, and you have to reaffix it in the proper place with a bracha. Now he says that if you place it, he says if you fix it on the below the upper third on the doorpost, you must remove it and refix it with a bracha. However, the common practice for Ashkenazim is that if you have a very, very tall doorway, which is, for example, common, sometimes you have even locally, you have on my block, this is for sure one that I've noticed, where you have these houses where in the front of the front door, there's a big archway which goes up 2 stories high. So a very, very tall doorway, we do not put it on the top third, we put it at shoulder height. Now there's different customs about this, and even within Chabad, there was a testimony of Rabbi Landau that in Rostov, in the Rebbe Rashab's quarters, they always put the mezuzah on the top third, even if it was a very tall doorway and you had to climb up with a ladder to do it. However, there is a halachic pamphlet that came out many years ago in English, which the Rebbe himself edited and clearly addressed the Rebbe wrote there that the practice is to put it on the top third, that at a very tall doorway, you put it at shoulder height. So even though in a normal doorway, we're very strict not to put it below the top third, on a very tall doorway, we do put it at shoulder height. Now then he says, and this is also explicit in the Gemara, that it's best to affix the mezuzah within the tefach closest to the outside of the doorpost. But if you deviate from this rule, the basic fulfillment of the mitzvah is unaffected. So again, if you have a doorway that has depth to it, so you put the mezuzah on the outermost tefach towards the front of the doorway. However, that doesn't invalidate it. If you put it anywhere within the depth of the doorway, it is fine. Why should you put the mezuzah at the front? So there's 2 reasons given. Tosfos says that the reason is because that it should protect you more. In other words, I mean, there's much to be said about this, and there's a sikh about this. We did this once years ago in the Sunday morning class. How do you understand the protection of mezuzah? The normative way of understanding it is that the fulfillment of the mitzvah of mezuzah protects you. Not that the physical scroll protects you, it's the mitzvah of it that protects you. But nevertheless, there is some element of the scroll itself being a segula for protection. And we find there was some, I think the Rebbe himself and the Frierdiker Rebbe used to keep a mezuzah on the desk, which is clearly not a place that's obligated to have a mezuzah. But so here also Tosfos seems to be saying the same thing, that it's not just the mitzvah of the mezuzah, but the actual mezuzah itself provides protection, and therefore you want to make sure to put your mezuzah as far out towards the front entrance as possible, so that more area is covered or governed by the mezuzah's protection. The other reason, which I think the Rambam gives, and there's much discussion about what the Rambam's opinion is in general, does the Rambam even agree at all that the mezuzah provides protection beyond the scope of today's class? But the other reason the Rambam gives is that when you see the mezuzah, it reminds you of God. So it reminds you to keep the mitzvahs. So the earlier you bump into the mezuzah, the more mindful of God you're going to be. Now, possibly he's going to get to this later. I'm sure he will. But I'll just point out that he's assuming here that you're putting the mezuzah within the depth of the doorway, which is certainly the preference. But sometimes you have a door that the door itself takes up the whole depth of the doorway. So then what do? So it depends. So sometimes you have space within the doorway behind the door. So actually the front door of this building, if you'll notice, that you can't put the mezuzah within the depth of the doorway in front of the door, because the door comes all the way to is flush with the thing. But the mezuzah is fixed, and you can see I put a stick there to make it to broaden the doorway. But the mezuzah is behind the door, but within the depth of the doorway. Sometimes that's not possible, and then you can put it like, especially if you think of a glass door, which there's no space at all within the depth of the doorway. So then you put it in the front to the side. Put it just on. Imagine this is the door, and right. So this little finger over here would be the area of the wall that is as close as possible to the doorway, and you put it over there in front of the doorway. But you may not put the mezuzah. But I was actually just somewhere here in Chicago yesterday, and it seemed like they had done it wrong. And but you can't put the mezuzah behind the door, not within the depth of the doorway, just sort of in the back wall. That's not okay. Now this, by the way, has some strong relevance to a very common mistake that people make on sliding doors. Winston Towers, many mezuzahs on Winston Towers I changed because they were not done properly, although it is kosher. It is kosher, even if it's not done properly. The way it is in Winston Towers, certainly it's kosher, but there's the ideal way to do it. Now, when you think of a sliding door, imagine a glass sliding door, let's say, that goes from your room onto your porch. So there's two panels. There's the stationary panel, and there's the panel that's the sliding door. Now, in English, colloquially, we might refer to that whole thing as the door. But halakhically, the stationary panel is not a door. The stationary panel is the wall. So now, two issues that come up. Number one is let's assume for argument's sake that we're going to put the mezuzah on the right, going from your living room onto your porch, which is some discussion. We'll get to that. If your right panel is the one that slides, if your left panel is the one that slides, and your right panel is the stationary one, then some people make the mistake of saying, well, this is my doorway, this whole thing is my doorway, and I'll put the mezuzah all the way to the right. But that way is that's not valid at all, because you've put the mezuzah 3 feet away from where the doorway is, right? Even though you're thinking of that whole thing of the door, actually the stationary panel is not a door. Now, and that's a mistake that I've seen, but another mistake, which is very common, is that even if you have, let's just say your right door is the sliding door and the left panel is the stationary one. So you're going to put the mezuzah right over there. But the door frame that we think of the door frame, which is the protruding, perimeter on the top and the sides, is encompassing that entire section, which we call door, which includes both the sliding door and the stationary panel. So that's not really the doorpost of that door. And so it's a little bit difficult for me to describe it, but if you look at a sliding door, if you have one at home, and I see at least one person who currently lives in Winston Towers, and I think, Steve, you used to live in Winston Towers, so, certainly over there it's something which is, I live there, is actually the correct place, and it's not just Winston Towers, most sliding doors are like this. Usually the correct place to put the mezuzah in a sliding door is actually inside the door frame. Inside the door frame, and there's usually a place that you could put a mezuzah there without it obstructing opening and closing the door. And more often than not, or often, it comes out that when the door is closed, you can't even see the mezuzah. And that's fine. There's no necessity to be able to see the mezuzah. The correct place for the mezuzah, if at all possible, is within the door frame itself, even if it won't be visible. And when the door is closed, even if it won't be visible at all. And so that's certainly something to be mindful of. It reminds me of a story where there was somebody who had an office in a building where we had a very strict rule of no religious, whatever the word is. So there were no trees and there were no menorahs, and there was, it was very completely neutral building. So he wanted to put a mezuzah on his office, and of course he was told, no, that's a religious symbol. So the truth is that perhaps if he was going to take this to court, he would argue that mezuzah is a religious requirement versus other religious things which are merely symbolic. There's no actual religious requirement to have a Xmas tree or even to have a menorah outside, but this is a requirement. Now, I don't know if he did or didn't do that. And by the way, very, very important, I should mention this. It's so important to know this because this comes up, and whether you yourself have this or you have friends or relatives, it comes up. People live in condo buildings, and condo buildings may have a rule of nothing outside in the door. I've dealt with this actually, Dan, for a neighbor of yours in Evanston, where he lives in a building where there's a very strict rule. So there is a law in many states in this country, including in Illinois. I forget all the exact parameters of the rule, but you could Google Mezuzah law Illinois, and there is a specific law that says it's absolutely illegal for any condo or landlord or anyone to object to a tenant or whatever it is, a shareholder, to having a mezuzah on the door. So that's a very useful thing. Sometimes, I actually have in my little mezuzah case, I have a photocopy of that, whatever the legislation is, so that if I ever get a challenge, I whisk it out of my thing and I say, here you go. Now, however, there is another solution. You could get your carpenter to come over, chisel out a hole in the door frame. I'm getting a virus and threat protection from Windows Defender summary. All right. And you could get your carpenter to come and chisel out a hole in the doorway and put your mezuzah in there and then cover it up with wood or plaster or cement or whatever it is. And it's fine. It's within the door frame. It's within a tefach, within that distance. And so it's kosher and nobody's ever going to know it's there. It's certainly not ideal. We'll see later. There's even an ideal to have specifically a transparent case so that you can actually see the mezuzah, but certainly the mitzvah is kosher in that way. Okay, how do you fix the mezuzah? You roll the parchment from the end to the beginning, that is from the word echad to the word shema, so that when you were to open the scroll, you would see it straight away. And then place the scroll in a tube or any other container and affix the mezuzah diagonally to the doorpost with nails. Now, okay, so he says in the tube, he doesn't say it's clearly, although there is a preference to have something that's see-through, that's transparent, so that you should be able to actually see the mezuzah. However, and it's also important to have on the outside of the mezuzah, you have that name of God, Shin Daled Yud, right? So you want those letters to be facing the entrance, entranceway, even if you can't see it. So even if you have a white case where you can't see it, but when you place the mezuzah into the tube, you should make sure that the letters are facing the front of the case so that they would be pointing into the entranceway. However, if you're going to have a mezuzah at a place where there is things not respectful happening in front of the mezuzah, so then it may be better to have white mezuzahs, non-clear cases. So, okay, let's finish the sif and then I'll elaborate on that a little bit. The angle of the diagonal should be such that the top of the mezuzah scroll, which begins with the word Shema, is toward the inside of the house, and the last line of the scroll is toward the outside, right? So the top of the mezuzah is bending inward. Now, actually, the Sephardi custom is that to put the mezuzah upright with no diagonal at all, similar to a Sefer Torah. They also keep the Sefer Torah. If you know those Sephardi scrolls, not all Sephardim, many Sephardim have those scrolls that they just put on the bima, standing upright. So we have our Sefer Torah on the bima on a slant where it's diagonal, and similarly the way it's stored in the Aron Kodesh, it's on a slight slant, but the Sephardim have it straight up, so it's the same idea. We have it on a slant, but ideally, again, this is not often. I've been to houses, people, they put the diagonal backwards. It doesn't matter, it doesn't invalidate it, but ideally, the top of the mezuzah should be facing inward. Okay, if the mezuzah is not sufficiently wide, you should affix the mezuzah in a vertical position. That does happen, especially if you have a big mezuzah. This is preferable to affixing it behind the door. If you did not affix the mezuzah, but merely hung the mezuzah, the mitzvah is invalid. Okay, sorry, this is preferable to affixing it behind the door. Now, like I said before, behind the door is kosher as long as it's within the door depth of the door frame. But even so, it's better for it to be in front of the door, in the depth of the door frame, even if it's going to be vertical and not diagonal. If you do not affix the mezuzah but merely hung the mezuzah is invalid. Similarly, you must be careful to fasten the mezuzah at its top and also its bottom so that it does not hang. Okay, let's just go back and say a few things about the beginning of the sif. So first of all, he spoke about fixing it with nails. Now, some people are machmir to do it with nails and to not nail it in that very strong. However, what I personally do and what I've heard from Rabbanim is that as long as you make sure it's most important is to make sure that it's fastened in a way that's tight and that's long lasting and it's not going to with time become loose. And that's something that's really important to, you often go to houses and you see mezuzahs which are sort of hanging on a little piece of sellotape, scotch tape or masking tape. It's not sturdy. It's not going to last over there. It's fine to use glue or even tape, but get the good quality tape. Locally, I like to use the Scotch brand double-sided tape. I found that for the most part, those are on the one hand, they're very sturdy and they stick. You can see here the mezuzahs in the building, but also on the other hand, that if you do ever have to remove them, it doesn't leave a lot of residue. But some doorways that doesn't work. For example, I found, again, locally, that outdoor doorways like that go to the material that they make for the door frame of the garages, like the Scotch tape just doesn't last over there. And so I don't actually use nails. I use a type of glue. I prefer a liquid nail, but whatever. Use a type of glue. Do something that's going to make sure that it stays there. Actually, personally, right over here in my office, I used to have the mezuzah up with nails, and it became loose. The nails were too narrow, and the mezuzah kept them thing. I was like, you know what? Better use Scotch tape. It's going to be more firm in there than it will be with nails. Okay. Now, so it should be in a case. So I said before, there is some preference to having it in a clear case. I don't know how important that is. It's actually interesting. I'm just thinking now, like if you think in 770, they don't actually have cases. It's like in this very thick, bendy plastic, but the mezuzah is wrapped in a white paper, so you can't actually see the mezuzah. Personally, what I did actually in my house is that on the main floor, all the mezuzahs are in clear cases. But upstairs with the bedrooms where you often have kids running around in not the most sneeze fashion, I put all white cases. Now, another thing to remember about that, and we'll finish with this, is in a master bedroom. In a master bedroom, so again, usually the mezuzah is going to be outside, but sometimes you do have a situation where the way the door is set up is that you have the mezuzah is within inside the bedroom, so that when you close the door, the mezuzah is on the inside. And also sometimes you have within the master bedroom a big walk-in closet or something which requires a mezuzah. And so you have a mezuzah that's, so to speak, visible from the bedroom. Now, there are different opinions as to what to do with this. I'll start from the top up. The most machmir opinion is that if you have such a mezuzah in the bedroom, even if it's in a solid colored case, so you can't see it, nevertheless, that's not good enough. And anytime the husband and wife engage intimately, you have to sort of put a hook on top of the mezuzah and hang a cloth or something over it to have another thing that's covering the mezuzah. That is the most strict opinion. I've heard of people doing that. No, I'm not sure. In Israel, I've seen that a few times. Actually, there's one house where I used to stay, where I used to often go to a relative to stay I stayed in the guest bedroom in Jerusalem, and the mezuzah on that room had, I was staying there as a single student, but it was a guest room for the guests, and they had next to the thing like a special sock or something that was sort of there to cover the mezuzah. Another opinion is, and I've done this for some people when I was doing sort of walkthroughs and doing this, and it came up, is that you do another layer. So before you put the mezuzah, let's say you have a white case, but before to put the mezuzah in the white case, you take another layer, let's say a sort of a tissue paper, and wrap it up so it has another layer of covering. And the most lenient opinion, which I believe is common to rely on, is that as long as it's not a clear case, that it's solidly covered, then and of course the mezuzah itself has a plastic or a paper wrapped around it, so then those two together are sufficient. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll pick up next week in Meretz Hashem from number 7. Stop recording.